Hi, my name is Rosanne. Today we'll be discussing how to approach essays, what to look for when answering an essay question, and how to upgrade essays to get from that 2-1 into that first class. So we'll be giving some tips and tricks that you can follow in order to improve your essay writing and tackle how to approach essay questions.
So, what does an essay entail? Essays require knowledge of the relevant law and a critical assessment of that law. So, it's really important to reflect on the law, how it applies, and what consequences stem from this. How the law applies to people, how it applies to cases that have happened, how it will apply to cases in the future. It's important to have a demonstration of the law and how and why it exists within its context. So, showing your understanding of the law and how it came about is really important. You can mention the historical developments of how the law came about and what this means regarding the scope of its application. Is it limited? Is it expansive? How will this affect things in the future? How has it affected things in the past? Answering the question directly with a clear and concise argument throughout. So, a clear structure will make it a lot easier for the examiner. They can follow your argument point by point, and the clearer your argument is set out, the easier it is for the examiner to see your line of argumentation, and it'll make your thesis a lot more cohesive. And I think at this point, it's important to consider both sides of the argument in order to fully flesh out the thesis. Definitely use this to your advantage, use the other side's argument to sort of supplement your main thesis. And with all this with all this in mind, please make sure to have the answer be confined within the scope of the question. I think it's really easy to go off topic and waffle a little bit, but every time you make a point, the answer should always be confined within the scope of the question, always refer back to the question, and make sure by the end of your essay, you've answered the question fully. So, breaking down the question. When you approach an essay question, again, it can be really, really daunting. Sometimes they just don't make sense, but you have to take a step back. You have to work through these questions because they'll give you loads of guidance, and you know the knowledge, you just have to apply it accordingly. So ask yourself these questions. Number one, what area of law is the question talking about? What legislation, what legal precedents, what cases is the question navigating you towards? Knowing the module helps. Trying to find which tutorial, which lectures, which topic falls in this question category within the module, so you know where to navigate to your revision if it's an open book exam. Number two, what themes are being hinted at in the question? Number three, what specific area of the law is relevant to the question? So this is where you nitpick the legislation, exactly what topic is being mentioned, and what sort of critical themes you already know or you've already been taught about, and you can build on from this. What are the different elements to the question when you break it up? So we'll go through this a little bit later, but when you see a question, there's different elements towards it. And this can help with building your structure if you break up the question into three little parts, or which part of the question is asking the critical point of view, and which part of the question is asking the relevant law. So obviously you need both these things, the relevant law and the critical side of it. So I think it's important to break down a question, just highlight the different sections, the different topics, and this will help make the question a lot more easy to tackle, I guess. Number five, what is the question actually asking? So this is so important. When you first read the question, it might not make any sense, but ensure that every single part of your essay answers the question. Every time you make a point, read the question and say, does this answer it? Because it's really easy to answer a question that you want it to be, or misread the question. It's really easy, especially under exam conditions. So always, always look back on the question and make sure you understand what the question's actually asking. So here are just some really important tips that you always need to keep in mind when you're answering an essay question. Describe the law before you critique it. Make sure you reference what law you're talking about, use evidence, otherwise you risk your critical point being diluted. There's no point making a great critical point if your relevant law isn't the relevant one and if you haven't explained it properly. Definitely don't go overboard, don't waffle on about the law and irrelevant stuff, but make sure that if the question is about a certain theme of this module, make sure you're talking about the specific point that you're making and how the specific point relates to the question. Don't just go on about the general theme or the general topic. Always refer back to the question to ensure consistency and relevancy. Every time you make a point, make sure it's directly relates to the question and helping it answer it in a certain way. I've mentioned this before, but it's so, so important when you're writing your essay plan, which we'll get to in a second. When you're writing your essay plan, make sure your point correlates to the question, that it answers the question in some way. If anything, it takes some wording from the question, because it's so easy to go off topic. It's so easy to go overboard with explaining things that you find interesting but aren't related to the question. And this moves on to the next point. Always, always, always plan. An essay outline will help you guide your answer. It'll help you avoid missing any points, and it helps you picture the structure of your essay. It also just helps you when you first see the question, you can get really overwhelmed. So if you sit back, think about how you're going to write this question. I always say that when you make a great essay plan, the essay writing afterwards is the easy part. If your plan is good, then you just got to refer back to it every single time you write. Even a quick bullet point plan with each point and the corresponding evidence will help so, so much. So I can't stress the importance of planning an essay. And this is where you can include like case names, you can include little quotes and stuff. You don't need to go overboard because you can do that in your essay, but even putting down the case, you won't forget mentioning it now because now you know that you have precedent, that you have evidence to your point, that you will mention it in your essay and you won't forget. And I think this last point is really important for if you want to hit that first class in an essay. If you adopt a unique perspective rather than the obvious point, this is what distinguishes the first class essays to the 2-1s. If you implement your own viewpoint, especially if you feel strongly about the question, it will really, really make your essay creatively stand out. And it personalizes your argument, which the examiner will really, really appreciate and will really notice. I think that really goes a long way and it adds a sort of person to the voice in an essay. So, I mean, this helps if you do extra reading around the topic, if you read a lot of different critical viewpoints, you can help build your own. So I think that's really important, and that would really help bring up the grade of your essay. So, don'ts. These are some points to keep in mind when you're writing your essay. Try to avoid waffling and irrelevance. It's really, really easy to overwrite to fill space if you're running out of ideas. And it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of writing every single thing you know about that area of law. I think it's really important that every single time you make a point, go back to the question and make sure it directly correlates to it, or at least works as a supplementary point that builds onto the main point. This is where the plan really helps. If you have a plan, you know that the plan, if you stick to the plan, it will answer the question. You won't overwrite. And with a plan, because your structure is sort of set out already, it makes it a lot easier to avoid overwriting. And I think overwriting, it uses space for key critical material or evidence. So where you're waffling, where you're using extra prose where you don't need to, you could actually use that space to mention a case or to mention a specific quote that is relevant. So I think use your space wisely, don't overwrite. And don't underestimate evidence. I think that goes back to our point just now, but using case law really demonstrates your legal knowledge. I think referencing quotes to either show a differing perspective or helps demonstrate a principle. I think it's really important to use judges' quotes, or if the quote in a textbook has a critical opinion that you can sort of embed into your answer, that's really important. Don't go overboard with quotes, but I think a quote is really important to show your reference to legal material. And I think critical material is really, really key when it comes to essays. Some textbooks are particularly good for critical opinions, so you can use that, intertwine it into your work, and also use it to argue against. If there's a critical point in the textbook that you don't agree with, you can use that as your other side argument. Don't answer the question you wish you were asked. It may be helpful to refer back to your old answers. You might have a question that was similar to it. You can take elements from that, especially if you were describing a certain legal principle in a really good way. I think you should definitely use that wording again. However, most of the time questions do look similar to trick you, and they will be asking you something completely different. If it looks the same, it might be from a different viewpoint. Like if it might look like the same area of law, you might have to argue the other side, or you might have to argue how it applies to a different group of people. So read the question really, really carefully. Don't fall into the trap of reading the question you wish you had because you planned for it or you already wrote it. If anything, having written an answer to a question that's similar really, really helps anyways, but you should always, always answer the question that's given in front of you and not the one that you did well in before. So, yeah. So now getting onto the structure of the actual essay itself, the introduction. What is the essay about? This is what the introduction is for. So you got to outline the main gist of the essay, what aspects of the question you'll be discussing. You've got to really, really dissect that question, dissect what it's trying to say, and dissect how you're going to answer every single element of it. Use the introduction to guide your argument, to guide how your argument will be developed and how it answers the question. So tell the reader how you will answer the question. Make it very, very easy for the examiner, because the easier it is for the examiner to read your argument, the better and more cohesive your argument will be and the better your grade will be. Make sure the paragraph is wrapped up by your argument and how you will interpret the law. Mention your thesis, mention how it will link to the question, and then that's it. Don't overwrite, but that should be good. So, getting to the main body, the most important part of the essay. Each paragraph should include a point and an evidence to support it. You can't have one without the other, it won't make any sense, and this will make sure every single paragraph you write is worth writing if it has both of those. You've got to work on the main argument before getting to the introduction and conclusion. I think this is a great tip. I think establishing the main points in your essay will make your introduction and your conclusion come so much more naturally, because you'll actually know what you're saying. And I think a lot of people, when they start writing an essay, they struggle a lot with, because they go straight to the introduction, they're like, I don't know what I'm going to say. So I think when you're planning it, or if you're not a planner, even though I really encourage you to be a planner, if you're writing your main body first, at least then you'll know what to say in your introduction and your conclusion. Plus, it stops you from overwriting in your introduction and your conclusion. Argue both sides. Use this opportunity to make the opposing argument supplement the main thesis. Why? Why not? And why should it? Why should it not? Why should the law be this way and why shouldn't it be this way? Is it this way? You've just got to always challenge yourself. When you're making a point, challenge yourself and try to see how the other side would argue against it. Because I think that really helps strengthen your argument if you know how to cover every single point, so that your examiner doesn't have any sort of questions afterwards, being like, what about this? What about this? If you've fully fleshed out your argument, there shouldn't be any space for that. Each point should intertwine. Each point should not only link and lead to the other, but link to the overarching argument you want to make. When the examiner is reading your essay, every single point should lead into the other. You shouldn't mention something in paragraph 1 that is explained in paragraph 3. It should always be chronological. So, and then once each point leads into each other, make sure they all sort of come in under the scope of the question. And this goes back to the always answer the question. So, yeah. So, finally, the conclusion. The conclusion reaffirms your point. You shouldn't be mentioning anything new. You should be bringing everything together and concluding your argument. So it bridges together each argument branch to form the main critical position that was introduced in the introduction. So this is a really good opportunity to let your personal voice shine through. If you bring in your own critical perspective into this, it will help you distinguish your essay. And this goes into having a unique ending line may help wrap the tone up of the essay. So this can be a suggestion of an improvement in the law, how further research may be needed, how the application of the law may result in an unintended consequence, and always make sure to avoid starting a new point. I think this is where you go into you need to ask yourself, why do you believe in your argument? And I think this part of the essay, the conclusion, is a really good way to sort of summarize why you come to the thesis that you introduced initially. So I think this. In the beginning, this is your thesis, your argument, this point, and in the end. Bring out certain elements of each paragraph, the main argumentative points. Bring them together and sort of form the foundation of your thesis and why in which it answers the question. So bring it all together, wrap it up, and link it back to the question. I think that's really important. Conclusion also shouldn't be too long. I think the introduction and conclusion can really stump people, but I think the conclusion is really important. It's important to sort of bring your voice in instead of doing all the legal research and talking like you did in your main body. So I think the conclusion is really, really important. And yeah, make sure you don't mention anything new. Don't start a new point or anything. Just bring back everything together so that the examiner remembers what you mentioned in the first paragraph and you've completely answered the question. So yeah. So critical themes. These are by no means exhaustive. These are just some ideas of critical themes that can be brought in when answering an essay question, because I get critical themes can be sort of confusing and a bit vague. But when you see an essay question, these are the sort of ideas that should be running through your head. How fair is the law? The law is all about fairness, it's all about justice. And I think bringing it back to why the law existed in the first place in order to achieve fairness and justice, think about how this applies to your question. If your answer has proven that the law is actually quite fair or it's not very fair. So always bring it back to that. What is the law trying to achieve? Is it effective? A lot of precedents, a lot of cases, a lot of legislation that are put in place are often trying to achieve an objective. What is this objective and has it been effective in doing so? Does the application of the law reveal any prejudice or bias, or does it address any prejudice or bias? This goes back to the previous point, but a lot of the time, critical points can be that the law sort of leaves out certain groups or certain people or certain cases that could come about, and I think it's really important to bring this in. Yeah, so what are the limitations of the law? Think about the scope of the law, think about what has challenged it, what cases have challenged it, what cases have restricted its scope. So in general, just think about how the law exists in the context of the legal sphere, what legislation was before it, what cases challenged its scope, and how this will affect future cases. So place the law in its context. I think context is so important in a critical essay. So yeah, always bear this in mind. So here are just a couple example questions. I'm just going through how you can sort of dissect a question when you first approach it. So when you break down a question, it really helps you tackle every single aspect, every single element, and making sure that you address the relevant law and the critical angle. So by pulling it apart, it can seem a lot easier to tackle when you first meet an essay question, and it helps with exam nerves, definitely. So if you look in these examples below, I've put the green as the relevant law and the red as the critical aspect. And every single essay question will have a critical aspect and a relevant law you should be discussing. So when you see the question in your exam, annotate the question and use this in your essay plan to make sure every part of the question is being answered. You can even break up each part of the question and have a paragraph relating to that part of the question. So you ensure that you answer every single part. And then in your conclusion, read the question as a whole, use it to summarize your conclusion and summarize your argument. So yeah. So yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this helped. I hope this gave you some tips and tricks, and I hope it sort of calmed your nerves in when you approach essay questions and given you some ideas of how you can plan around them, how you can approach them, and how you can jump your grade from a 2-1 to a first. So yeah, thank you.